Hi everyone, this is Nick with TestPlant. Welcome to our eggPlant video training series. In this series, we'll introduce you to many of the powerful features of eggPlant Functional and dive into some advanced topics in test automation. In the current session, we'll discuss preparing to set up your test environment. We'll review the fundamentals of an eggPlant deployment plan and then discuss test resources and test environment and architecture. We'll eventually build to an understanding about how resources, environment, and architecture shape a deployment plan that is most reasonable for you. So what is a deployment plan, and why is it important? In our context, a deployment plan contains a definition of our project goals, some specified way to meet those goals, and finally, some method to review our progress. Of course, we recognize, even expect, that your projects might change shape or direction. So our focus on deployment here is especially meant to capture the initial stages of your eggplant project, which usually turns out to be the first 3 months or so. A deployment plan is important because it provides clarity and direction for your automation project. So with this basic picture of a deployment plan in place, let's get into some of the relevant details. We'll cover all three of these pieces: defining goals, designing the approach, and reviewing progress. Then we'll loop back to test resources and test architecture. One reason that a deployment plan is important is because it allows us to clearly define our project goals. But it's critical that we sort out two different kinds of goals that are relevant here. To start, TestPlant customers have resources on eggplant automation projects because doing so allows them to achieve their business requirements. Some example business requirements include improving your product quality, reducing time to market, shortening a regression cycle, or decreasing reliance on manual testing resources. Business requirements serve as the motivation or the grounding for an automation project. They demonstrate and explain the value that the project will bring. So it's helpful to specify business requirements in your deployment plan because as your automation project is created, begins, and as it progresses, all of the relevant stakeholders should understand the value that they're after. So your business requirements here are the first type of goals that need to be defined. The other important goals specified in a deployment plan are a project's technical requirements. Technical requirements follow from business requirements in the sense that if we achieve our project's technical requirements, then we'll also achieve our business requirements. Some example technical requirements include automating a smoke test for an application, or converting some set of manual test cases into eggplant functional automation tests. Ultimately then, the process of defining your goals begins by stating your business requirements and ends by stating the technical requirements that will, when achieved, have you realize the value that motivated your project in the first place. After your goals are defined, it's time to design a reasonable strategy for attaining those goals. And straightforwardly, a good design here will require that we consider the significant details about your project. We find it useful to identify and then organize these details by asking who, what, when, why, and how about your project. Your roster specifies the people resources of you, the customer, TestPlant, and potentially a service partner that you've chosen to work with. Your scope specifies the systems, devices, and applications that are targeted for automation and testing. Your timeline provides a schedule for achieving various project milestones. Your value is described by your business requirements, which we just covered. And finally, your implementation specifies the infrastructure that is necessary to carry out your technical requirements. All of these pieces should be considered when designing an approach to meet our project goals. Next, I want to touch briefly upon the last piece of a deployment plan, an approach for reviewing our progress, but we'll return to a discussion about roster, scope, and implementation when we discuss test resources and test architecture. Alright, so at this point we've reviewed the important points of defining your project goals and the details we'll need to consider when designing a strategy to meet those goals. The last significant piece of your eggplant deployment plan will be a specification of how we'll review your progress at the end of the deployment period. Ultimately, The timeline of your deployment plan will contain information about the duration of your automation project's deployment phase, and more specifically, it will map out the dates that will review our progress. To tie all of this back to our previous discussion, your timeline will indicate when you should be meeting your technical requirements. In many cases, this simply involves a review of the number of tests that we were able to automate. Reviewing progress is important because it allows us to confirm that the achievement of our technical requirements gained us the value that's expressed by our business requirements. As your project shifts out of its deployment phase, the result of this review process will help to inform and shape our project moving forward. So those are the nuts and bolts of a deployment plan for your eggPlant functional automation project. Now we'll move on to two related topics that we've already covered in brief: your test resources and your test architecture. When we discussed designing a strategy for achieving our project goals, we mentioned your roster. Your roster is the first test resource that we want to explain more carefully. In all cases, your roster will have two sources. As you might expect, the first source of the roster is you, the customer. Here we've listed many of the common customer-side members of an automation project. The second source of your roster is TestPlant. From the TestPlant side, customers are supported by their account manager, their technical account manager, and by the TestPlant support team. In some cases, customers choose to utilize a service partner to assist with their automation project, and in such cases, the partner will also contribute resources to your roster. Fundamentally, your roster is important because it helps all of your project stakeholders understand a division of responsibilities. Of course, the availability of testers and other roster members will impact our timeline, our scope, and our implementation. Assessing our test resources also plays a role in setting our project scope and our project implementation. Besides the resources on our roster, some key resources are our systems, devices, and applications under test. Let's say that our technical requirement is to automate the installation of some application build on an Android device, and then to validate that the application launches as expected. To carry out this requirement, the minimum resources that we'll need are the target Android device and the target application build. And this is exactly how our resources constrain our automation project. If we want some system or device or application tested or automated in some particular way, then there is simply the need that we have access to the resources to do so. In the very same way, our test resources will constrain which project test cases and workflows can be automated. Our test resources will also guide our implementation. Each of our resources will be a component of the infrastructure that exists to meet our project goals. Further resources that will shape our implementation include integrations into any continuous integration software or application lifecycle management tool, and the geographic location of our testers and our test systems and devices. Finally, let's discuss the test architecture for your eggPlant functional automation project. When designing your test architecture, there are some important points to keep in mind. First, it's critical to understand that eggPlant functional operates in a two-system model. One of the systems in this model is the test controller, which is where eggPlant functional is installed and where our automation scripts are developed. In this diagram, those are the systems on the left. The other system is the system under test, which is the system that is automated and tested when we execute an eggPlant functional script. These are the systems on the right. The two-system model is especially valuable because it allows us to automate and test in a non-invasive way. We preserve the production state of the system under test. Second, it's important to understand that eggPlant functional's image-based approach is technology agnostic. This means that we can test any technology, browser, platform, and device. When designing your architecture, remember that this holds true for any device category. TestPlant customers are actively automating devices from all of these categories and more. Here's a simple test architecture diagram that captures much of what we've just covered. Again, eggPlant functional is installed on our controller machines where our tests are developed. When our tests are executed, They automate the systems, devices, and applications that are targeted by our technical requirements. In many cases, customers utilize eggPlant functional team licenses when developing tests. Team licenses are great because they can be shared by testers in different locations. When using a team license, you'll run a team license server, or TLS, somewhere in your environment. If you have a 3-user team license, for instance, you can run 3 copies of eggPlant functional at the same time, but the machines that run the eggPlant functional application can vary. eggPlant functional and the TLS share two-way communication on UDP port 5538. In many cases, customers also utilize eggPlant Manager to schedule and execute eggPlant functional tests. You can access eggPlant Manager on the server where it's installed, or you can access it through a browser-based UI on some other system in your environment. Again, thanks for joining us for our video training series, and watch out for the next video soon.